The alkali dust, fine as powdered bone, clung to Alara's lips, a bitter kiss of death upon the parched earth. Hours, or perhaps years, had passed since the screams had ceased, since the echoes of gunfire had faded, leaving only the buzzing silence of flies and the vast, indifferent sky overhead. The sun was a malevolent eye in a bleached expanse, beating down on the wreckage, on the scattered remnants of lives extinguished in brutal, swift violence. Splintered wood, torn canvas, the metallic tang of blood heavy on the stagnant air. These were the monuments to her former life, to the hope that had drawn them west. Now, only she remained, a solitary, trembling figure amidst the carnage, her clothes ripped, stained, her mind a landscape as shattered as the wagons around her. Every shadow held a threat, every rustle of dry grass a potential ambush. Trust had been a luxury she could no longer afford, a word hollowed out and spat upon by the events of the day. Trust in God, in her fellow travelers, in the illusion of safety on the open trail, all annihilated. She was alone, utterly and terrifyingly alone, with nothing but the instinct to survive clawing its way through the thick fog of shock. Her throat was raw, a testament to silent screams and choked-back sobs. Water felt like a forgotten dream, food a concept belonging to another world. Her body moved on pure, desperate will, a mechanical act of self-preservation. She scavenged, though the word felt too dignified for the act of pawing through the debris of her own tragedy. A dented canteen, miraculously still holding a few precious swallows. A torn blanket, offering meager protection against the coming cold of the desert night. A broken knife, its blade chipped but still capable of inflicting a wound. These were her treasures, gleaned from the graveyard of her companions. Her gaze darted constantly, scanning the horizon, the low scrub, the gullies that offered concealment to unseen eyes. Every instinct screamed danger, every nerve ending was frayed and exposed. There was nowhere safe, no one to turn to. The world had shown her its true face, brutal, unforgiving, devoid of mercy. Her hands, scraped and trembling, dug into the dry soil, seeking any sign of life, any hope of escape from this desolate tableau. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy, broken only by her own ragged breath and the ceaseless drone of insects drawn to the scent of ruin. She moved with a furtive caution, like a hunted animal, keeping low, using what little cover the sparse terrain offered. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and red, a beautiful, cruel spectacle over the scene of horror. The beauty felt like a mockery. Darkness was coming, and with it, unknown terrors. She had to move, had to disappear, to become just another shadow swallowed by the vastness. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her feet were raw and blistered inside her worn boots, but the primal urge to live pushed her onward. Away from the dead, away from the memories, into the indifferent wilderness that stretched endlessly in every direction. The weight of her aloneness was a physical burden, heavier than any pack she could have carried. It settled in her bones, in her soul, promising a future of solitary vigilance and perpetual fear. She was the last ember of a fire extinguished, flickering precariously in the harsh wind, with no warmth left to share, and no trust left to give. The landscape itself seemed hostile, the rocks sharp, the plants thorny, the ground uneven. Each step was a conscious effort, a victory over despair. She stumbled, catching herself on a sharp rock, her hand scraping against the rough surface. The pain was a welcome distraction from the ache in her heart, from the emptiness that yawned within her. She looked back once, a fleeting, agonizing glance at the silent camp. Then, she turned her face forward, towards the darkening horizon, and walked, a lone figure shrinking against the immensity of the land and the enormity of her loss, carrying the terrible knowledge that the world outside was a place of profound danger, and that trust was a vulnerability she could never again afford. The wind picked up, a mournful sigh whistling through the skeletal remains of the wagons, carrying the dust and the memories, chasing her into the night. She did not look back again. The sun climbed the sky with relentless efficiency, leaching the moisture from the earth and from Alara's very being. Her steps were faltering now, her legs aching, her breath shallow and ragged. The few mouthfuls of water from the canteen were long gone, a distant, tantalizing memory. Her tongue felt thick and swollen in her mouth, her lips cracked and peeling. Every rise in the land promised a view, a potential landmark, but delivered only more endless, undulating terrain under the merciless sun. She hugged the shadows of gullies and rock formations when she could, but the shade was fleeting, offering only momentary respite from the oppressive heat. Hunger gnawed at her gut, a constant, dull ache that sapped her strength and blurred her vision. The landscape, once a passive backdrop to her escape, now felt actively hostile, a vast, sun-scorched adversary intent on breaking her. She saw mirages shimmer in the distance, pools of water that vanished as she approached, figures that dissolved into heat haze. Her mind, already fragile, began to play tricks on her, whispering doubts, suggesting surrender. But the terror of what she had left behind, and the sheer, stubborn refusal to let them win, whatever they were, kept her moving. It was during a particularly grueling stretch, clambering over a rocky outcrop, that she saw the signs. Not clear, undeniable tracks, but subtle disturbances. A stone recently overturned. A broken twig where there should not have been one. A faint print in a patch of sand. Not hers. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of renewed fear. She froze, scanning the surroundings with desperate intensity. Nothing. Only the shimmering heat, the rocks, the scrub. Yet, the feeling persisted, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the undeniable sense of being watched. It was a quiet presence, unlike the brutal, overt violence of the massacre. More like the predator stalking its prey, unseen, unheard, known only by the ripple of disturbance it leaves in its wake. She dropped to her belly behind a low cluster of rocks, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Who could it be? Had some of them followed her? Or was it someone else, drawn by the aftermath, a scavenger, human or otherwise? The thought sent a fresh wave of cold dread through her. She had survived the initial storm, but the desert was full of hidden dangers, and her vulnerability felt immense. She stayed hidden for a long time, muscles cramping, the sun beating down on her exposed back. The silence returned, but it was a tense, expectant silence, charged with unseen energy. When she finally dared to move, it was with renewed caution, her eyes constantly scanning, her senses on high alert. She moved more slowly now, conserving energy, but also meticulously checking her backtrail, looking for any further confirmation of her fear. The signs were sparse, almost imperceptible to an untrained eye, but to Alara, whose survival now depended on acute observation, they were terrifyingly clear. A scuff mark near a patch of soft ground. A single, distinct footprint, not the heavy, booted print of the men who had attacked the wagons, but something different, lighter, perhaps even moccasined. The thought sent a jolt of icy fear through her. An Apache. The whisper of the word in her mind was potent, loaded with years of fearful tales, of perceived savagery and violence. If she was being followed by an Apache, her chances of survival dwindled to almost nothing. They knew the land, were part of it in a way she could never be. They could move unseen, strike without warning. Her deepest fears, the ones born of stories and prejudices, surged to the surface. She stumbled forward, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the face of this new, terrifying possibility. She had to hide, to evade, to somehow outwit a tracker in his own territory. The task felt insurmountable. She found a small, shallow cave tucked into the base of a rocky hill. It offered meager shelter from the sun, a patch of cool earth to rest her aching body. She crawled inside, pulling her torn blanket around her, trying to disappear into the shadows. Her heart pounded, a frantic captive against her ribs. She closed her eyes, trying to control her breathing, to listen. The only sounds were the wind, the distant cry of a hawk, and the buzzing of flies outside the entrance. Was he out there, watching, waiting? The paranoia was a physical weight, pressing down on her, suffocating her. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't stay anywhere for long. Trust was a deadly mistake. And the one person she now suspected was following her was the embodiment of everything she had been taught to fear. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows. The air cooled slightly, but offered no relief from the internal inferno of her fear. She curled into a ball, the broken knife clutched in her hand, listening to the sounds of the approaching night, everyone amplified by her terror, waiting for the silent approach she felt certain was coming. He appeared like a figure conjured from the landscape itself. One moment, the rocky ridge against the twilight sky was empty. The next, he was there, silhouetted against the fading light. Alara saw him from her meager hiding place, her breath catching in her throat, a cold wave washing over her. He was an Apache, unmistakable in his attire and bearing. Tall, lean, with hair the color of raven's wings, unbound and stirring in the wind. His face was sharp, angular, his gaze directed towards her location, though she was certain she was well hidden. He carried a rifle, held loosely, almost negligently, but she knew it was not just a tool for hunting. He stood there for a long moment, perfectly still, observing. He did not shout, did not brandish his weapon, did not make any threatening move. His stillness was unnerving, a quiet intensity that felt both predatory and something she couldn't name. Fear was her immediate, visceral response. This was it, the end. She braced herself, gripping the broken knife, though she knew it would be useless against a rifle. Her mind raced, replaying the warnings she'd heard throughout her life about the savages of the plains and deserts. All the ingrained prejudice, all the fear-mongering tales, came flooding back, magnified tenfold by her recent trauma. This man, this Apache, represented everything she was supposed to be terrified of. After his silent observation, he moved, not towards her, but along the ridge, his movements fluid and soundless, almost part of the natural world. He stopped a short distance away, then knelt. Alara watched, confused. He wasn't setting an ambush, wasn't approaching. What was he doing? He appeared to be building a small fire. A fire? In the open? Seemed reckless, inviting discovery. But as the first tentative flame flickered to life, she noticed something else. He wasn't building it for warmth or cooking. He placed a small bundle of dried herbs on the flames. A thin column of fragrant smoke rose into the air, caught by the breeze, and drifted away. He stayed by the fire only for a few minutes, then rose and moved away from the ridge, disappearing into the gathering gloom as silently as he had appeared. Alara remained frozen, her heart still pounding. What had that been? A signal? A warning? Or something she couldn't possibly understand? The smell of the burning herbs reached her, a strange, earthy scent she didn't recognize. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was foreign, mysterious. The small fire burned down quickly, leaving only glowing embers in the darkness. He was gone, but the knowledge of his presence lingered, a heavy weight in the air. She didn't dare move, didn't dare leave her inadequate shelter. Was he waiting for her to come out? Was this a trap? Her fear warred with a desperate need for understanding. His actions defied her expectations, her prejudices. He had seen her, she was certain of it, yet he hadn't attacked. He had simply been present. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped. The thin blanket offered little protection against the biting chill that descended upon the desert floor. She shivered, her body aching, her mind reeling. Sleep was impossible. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound was magnified, interpreted as a sign of his return. She stared out into the darkness, trying to pierce the veil, trying to see the unseen watcher. He had shown her his face, albeit in silhouette, and it was the face of her deepest fear. Yet, his actions were a puzzle she couldn't solve. The little fire, the smoking herbs. It made no sense in the context of the brutal narratives she carried in her mind. She spent the night in a state of high alert, curled in a ball, listening, waiting. The silence of the wilderness was profound, broken only by the occasional cry of a night bird or the skittering of unseen creatures. But beneath the natural sounds, She felt the tension, the awareness of another being nearby. He was out there, following, watching, and she didn't know why. The mystery was almost as terrifying as the threat itself. She was alone, yes, but no longer unwatched. That was a new kind of terror, and a new kind of vulnerability she hadn't anticipated. The second day of his presence was a silent dance of pursuit and evasion. Alara moved cautiously, trying to vary her path, seeking out rocky ground or streambeds where her tracks might be harder to follow, though she knew instinctively that such efforts were likely futile against someone with his tracking skill. She saw him occasionally, a fleeting glimpse of movement on a distant ridge, a figure blending seamlessly with the landscape, only his unnerving stillness giving him away. He never closed the distance, never called out, never made any overtly hostile gesture. He simply was, a silent shadow dogging her steps. This passive presence was more unsettling than an outright confrontation would have been. It allowed her fear to fester, her imagination to run wild. Was he waiting for her to weaken? To make a mistake? Was this a cruel game? Her internal monologue was a constant, frantic debate. Run faster, hide better. But where? The desert offered few places to truly disappear. And even if she could, she was desperately low on supplies. The meager water was gone, and she hadn't found anything edible. Her strength was ebbing, her legs heavy, her head light. She felt a growing sense of desperation, a realization that she couldn't outrun him. Not in this condition, not in this land. Late in the afternoon, parched and stumbling, she came across a small, hidden spring, barely more than a seep of water collecting in a hollowed-out rock. It was difficult to spot, concealed by a tangle of brush and rocks. As she knelt, cupping her hands to drink, she saw a faint, almost invisible sign, a small, triangular arrangement of pebbles near the spring's edge, partially obscured by sand. It wasn't a natural formation. It looked like a deliberate marker, placed to be seen by someone who knew what to look for. By him? The thought was jarring. If he had found the spring, why hadn't he taken the water or fouled it? Why leave it for her? The act was confusing, contradicting everything she expected. Was it a trap? A lure? Or something else? She hesitated, fear warring with her desperate thirst. The water looked clear, cool. Her body screamed for it. After a long, agonizing moment of indecision, the primal need for survival overruled her fear. She drank, cautiously at first, then with desperate gulps, feeling the life-giving liquid soothe her parched throat and revive her weary spirit. As she drank, she scanned the surrounding area, searching for any sign of his presence. Nothing. He was invisible again. But the small pile of rocks remained, a silent question mark in the sand. He had known she was coming this way. He had found the spring, and he had left it accessible to her. Why? The act chipped away at the solid wall of her fear and prejudice, introducing a crack of uncertainty. He wasn't behaving like the savage of the stories. He wasn't attacking, wasn't tormenting her. He was allowing her to survive, guiding her in his silent, inscrutable way. The thought was revolutionary, terrifying in its implications. It meant that perhaps her understanding of this man, of his people, was wrong. And if that was wrong, what else was? The massacre, the pure, unreasoning hatred she had witnessed, had solidified her belief in a world divided into us and them, into good and evil. This man, this Apache, was complicating that simple, brutal worldview. She stayed by the spring for a while longer, resting, allowing the water to revitalize her. When she moved on, she did so with a new layer of confusion added to her fear. She was still being followed, still vulnerable, but the nature of the pursuit had changed. Felt less like hunting and more like observing. As night fell, she found a slightly more sheltered spot beneath an overhang. She huddled there, the cold seeping into her bones. She didn't see him build a fire this time, didn't see him at all. But she felt his presence, a silent sentinel somewhere in the darkness. She clutched the broken knife, but her grip was less rigid than before. The image of the small pile of rocks by the spring, the clean water, played in her mind. A flicker of something tentative, fragile, began to form in the vast, desolate space of her fear, the possibility, however terrifying, that not all her assumptions about the world, and the people in it, were true. The third day began with a shared sunrise, though they were still separated by a significant distance. Alara saw him on a ridge line in the pre-dawn light, a dark silhouette against the pale sky. He was simply sitting, watching the sun come up. When the light grew stronger, he rose and began to move, his path roughly parallel to hers. The silent proximity was becoming a strange, tense routine. She no longer felt the immediate, paralyzing terror of the first day, but a wary, heightened awareness. He was still a threat, still an unknown, but the edge of pure, unreasoning fear had dulled, replaced by a complex mix of apprehension, confusion, and a sliver of reluctant curiosity. She found more signs throughout the day, a small cache of edible roots left near a trail she was likely to follow, marked again by a subtle arrangement of stones. A discarded skin of water, half full, placed on a visible rock. Each discovery was a small shock, a silent communication that baffled her. Why? What did he want? Was this some elaborate form of torture, keeping her alive only to capture her later? Or was it something else entirely? Her mind struggled to reconcile these acts of silent provision with the brutal images she held of Apache warriors. She watched him whenever she could, trying to glean information from his movements, his posture. He moved with an economy of motion, perfectly adapted to the terrain. He seemed to know the land intimately, reading its subtle signs, moving through it like a part of it. He hunted small game. She saw him once, a swift, efficient kill with a bow, something she couldn't have managed. He ate sparingly, seemingly needing little to sustain himself. His stoic demeanor was impenetrable. His face, when she caught glimpses of it across the distance, revealed nothing. He was a mystery, a walking paradox that challenged the foundations of her understanding. As the day wore on, the heat intensified, becoming a physical weight that pressed down on her. She was weaker than she let herself admit, the fatigue and lack of food and water beginning to take their toll despite the small help he offered. She stumbled more often, her steps dragging. At one point, crossing a particularly steep and treacherous gully, her foot slipped on loose rock. She cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound of pain and fear, as she twisted her ankle. She fell heavily, the breath knocked out of her, a searing pain shooting up her leg. She lay there for a moment, stunned, the world swimming before her eyes. She heard a sound, a rapid movement, and saw him approaching, moving with incredible speed and agility down the slope. Panic flared. He was coming. Now was the moment. She scrambled back, trying to rise despite the blinding pain, fumbling for the broken knife, ready to defend herself, futile as she knew it would be. He stopped several feet away, his rifle still slung over his shoulder. He looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't advance further. He simply waited, observing her struggle. The pain was excruciating. Her ankle was swelling rapidly. She couldn't walk on it. Despair washed over her, cold and absolute. She was stranded, vulnerable, at the mercy of the very person she feared most. He took a step closer, then another, moving slowly, deliberately, watching her reaction. She flinched back, pressing herself against the rocky wall of the gully. He stopped again, then slowly, carefully lowered his rifle to the ground. He knelt, still a short distance from her. He gestured towards her injured ankle with a hand, a simple, clear motion. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was indicating her injury. Confusion warred with her ingrained fear. She stared at him, panting, trying to understand. He gestured again, then made a small, reassuring sound, low in his throat, like a soft, questioning grunt. It wasn't a threat. It was
tentative.
Her mind reeled. He was offering help? An Apache helping a white woman who had just survived a massacre, presumably by other white men? It made no sense. Yet the pain was debilitating. She couldn't move. She was completely helpless. She looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of malice, any hidden cruelty. They were dark, ancient, full of a quiet knowledge, but she saw no hatred there, only a steady, assessing gaze. After a long, tense silence, she slowly, reluctantly, loosened her grip on the broken knife. She didn't drop it, but she lowered it slightly. It was a small gesture, but for her it felt monumental. A tiny crack in the impenetrable wall of her distrust, forced open by pain and necessity, and the silent, unexpected actions of the man before her. He moved closer then, slowly, deliberately, watching her face for any sign of renewed panic. Alara flinched as he knelt beside her, but she didn't cry out or try to pull away. The pain in her ankle was a brutal, undeniable reality that superseded her fear for the moment. He reached out a hand, not towards her, but towards her injured leg. His movements were calm, expert. He gently probed her ankle, his touch surprisingly light and skilled. He spoke for the first time, his voice low, guttural, the language unknown to her, but the tone was quiet, assessing. It wasn't the harsh, angry sounds she had heard during the massacre. He felt the swelling, the dislocation perhaps. He straightened up slightly, looking at her face again. He pointed to himself, then placed his hand over his heart. Then he pointed to her. He spoke her name, Alara, tentatively, as if unsure. She must have spoken it aloud at some point, in her delirium or grief. She nodded, her throat tight. He nodded back, a brief, acknowledging dip of his head. Then he pointed to himself again, and spoke a word, Kai Kai, his name. The man who had followed her, watched her, provided for her, and now, inexplicably, was helping her. The sound of his name felt significant, solidifying his presence, making him real beyond her fears and projections. He looked at her ankle again, then pointed towards a patch of desert brush nearby. He spoke a few more words in his language, then gestured as if crushing something. He rose and moved towards the brush, breaking off several stalks of a plant she didn't recognize. He returned to her side, and with surprising gentleness, he began to chew the stalks, creating a poultice in his mouth. Alara watched, morbidly fascinated, her fear momentarily forgotten in the face of this strange, intimate act. He then carefully applied the mashed plant matter to her swollen ankle, wrapping it in strips of leather he took from a pouch. His touch was firm but gentle, his movements precise. As he worked, he hummed a low, melodic tune, a sound that seemed to belong to the wind and the rocks. It was a sound of the land, ancient and comforting in its strangeness. The poultice brought a cooling sensation, a subtle relief from the searing pain. When he finished, he looked at her, his dark eyes steady. He gestured towards the setting sun, then towards the direction they had been traveling, then made a downward motion with his hand, indicating stopping. He conveyed, without a single word she understood, that she couldn't travel further that day, that they would stop here. He then moved away to build a fire. This time, he built it closer to her, a small, efficient fire that cast a warm glow in the rapidly cooling air. He moved with quiet purpose, gathering dry wood, arranging stones. He didn't ask for her help, didn't seem to expect it. He was simply taking care of the necessities. He had hunted earlier, she remembered, and now he began to prepare a small rabbit over the fire. The smell of cooking meat, after days of starvation, was almost unbearable. He cooked it slowly, carefully. When it was done, he tore off a piece and offered it to her. Alara hesitated, the ingrained caution still strong. But hunger was a powerful force, and the image of the water and the roots he had left for her chipped away at her resistance. She reached out a trembling hand and took the meat. It was cooked simply, without seasoning, but it tasted like the most delicious thing she had ever eaten. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, while Kai ate his share in silence. The only sounds were the crackling fire, the night insects, and their quiet chewing. Sitting there, in the flickering firelight, sharing food with this man she had so deeply feared, felt surreal. He was not the monster of her nightmares. He was quiet, capable, and for reasons she couldn't fathom, he was helping her. The wall of her distrust, built so high and so quickly after the massacre, was not collapsing. but it was certainly shifting, the edges softening under the unexpected weight of his quiet kindness and competence. She watched him as he tended the fire, his face illuminated by the flames. It was a face etched with the lines of the sun and wind, a face that belonged to this land. And in that moment, illuminated by the fire, sharing the silence and the food, the stark lines of US, and them blurred just enough for a fragile, tentative bridge to begin to form across the vast chasm of her fear. The sprained ankle, though painful, forced a pause in Alara's desperate flight and, paradoxically, accelerated the development of the fragile connection between her and Kai. They spent the next day camped in the gully. Alara's movements were restricted, and she had no choice but to rely on him. He accepted this necessity with quiet equanimity, moving around her with a minimum of fuss. He checked her ankle periodically, reapplying the poultice with practiced hands. He hunted, bringing back small game, lizards, birds, which he cooked and shared with her. He also found edible plants and roots, teaching her through gestures and pointing which were safe and which were not. Their communication remained almost entirely nonverbal. He used simple hand signs, pointed, and used facial expressions to convey his meaning. Alara, forced to pay close attention, began to learn his silent language. She learned that a certain tilt of his head meant he was listening intently to distant sounds, that a particular arrangement of his fingers meant water was nearby, that a sharp, low whistle was a warning. She, in turn, used gestures to indicate her pain, her hunger, her need for water. It was a slow, painstaking process, but with each exchange, a tiny thread of understanding was woven between them. Her internal monologue shifted from frantic fear to wary observation and grudging acceptance. She watched him constantly, fascinated by his ease in the environment that had seemed so hostile to her. He moved through the desert like a part of it, his senses attuned to its subtle rhythms. He could read the tracks of animals, predict changes in the weather, find resources where she saw only barrenness. His knowledge was profound, a wisdom born of generations living in harmony with the land. It was a stark contrast to the destructive, chaotic force that had swept through her wagon train. She began to see him not just as an Apache, the embodiment of a fearful stereotype, but as Kai, an individual, quiet, capable, patient. She observed his respect for the natural world, the way he took only what was needed, wasted nothing. She saw the quiet strength in his eyes, the resilience that mirrored her own burgeoning determination. She felt the protective shield he seemed to cast around their small camp, his constant vigilance, his awareness of everything around them. He never spoke of the massacre, never asked about her past, never pressed her for information. He simply accepted her presence, her trauma, her fear, with a silent understanding that was more comforting than any words could have been. One evening, sitting by the fire, Alara, in a rare moment of lowered guard brought on by exhaustion and the strange sense of safety his presence now provided, drew a shaky finger in the dirt. She drew a circle, then lines radiating from it, a sun. Then she drew stick figures, many of them holding hands in a long line, the wagon train. Then she drew jagged lines cutting through them, scattering the figures. She pointed to the scattered figures, then to herself, a single, isolated stick figure. Then she drew a mountain, a single, lonely peak. It was a crude representation of her journey, her loss, her aloneness. Kai watched her in silence, his gaze steady. When she finished, he reached out and gently erased the jagged lines, smoothing the dirt. He then drew a single, strong line from her lone figure, connecting it to another stick figure, his own. He didn't say anything, but the gesture was clear, powerful. He acknowledged her pain, her loss, but he also drew a connection, a shared path. Tears welled in Alara's eyes, the first she had shed since the initial shock had worn off. He didn't comment, didn't reach out to comfort her physically, but he remained still, present, allowing her the space to grieve in his quiet company. In that moment, the last vestiges of her absolute distrust began to crumble. He was not her enemy. He was not indifferent. He was, in his own silent way, a protector, a companion in the vast, desolate wilderness. The bond forming between them was not built on shared history or easy conversation, but on mutual vulnerability, quiet observation, and the undeniable reality of his unexpected kindness. It was a fragile thing, but it was growing, root by root, in the unforgiving soil of their shared existence. Their journey resumed, albeit at a slower pace due to Alara's still healing ankle. The silent partnership continued, strengthening with each shared hardship. They faced the elements together, searing heat during the day, biting cold at night, the sudden fury of a desert thunderstorm that swept through with violent force, forcing them to seek shelter together under a rocky overhang, huddled close against the wind and rain. In the close confines, the air thick with moisture and the scent of wet earth, the unspoken bond between them deepened. There was no awkwardness, no need for conversation. Simply shared breathing, shared shelter, shared resilience in the face of the storm's onslaught. Alara watched Kai's face in the flickering light of his small fire, a face calm and accepting, attuned to the storm's passage. She felt a sense of safety she hadn't experienced since before the massacre, a feeling that stemmed not from walls or weapons, but from the quiet competence and protective presence of the man beside her. He began to teach her more about the land, not through words, but by example and simple gestures. He showed her how to identify edible plants, how to find water in unlikely places, how to build a shelter that offered protection from the sun and wind, how to move quietly and observe the natural world around her. Alara, a quick learner whose survival depended on absorbing this knowledge, paid close attention, mimicking his movements, observing his techniques. She learned to read the subtle signs he pointed out, the way the wind shaped the sand, the flight of birds indicating a water source, the type of vegetation revealing the nature of the soil. Her perspective on the wilderness began to change. It was still harsh, still dangerous, but it was also full of life, full of resources, if one knew where to look. Kai's relationship with the land was not one of conquest or fear, but of respect and understanding. He moved with it, not against it. This was a profound lesson for Alara, whose previous experience had been one of trying to impose order on a chaotic world. As her physical strength returned, her internal strength grew as well. The constant, debilitating fear that had defined her since the massacre began to recede, replaced by a quiet determination and a burgeoning sense of capability. She was no longer just a survivor. She was learning to live in this new, challenging world. She helped Kai in small ways, gathering wood, preparing food, keeping watch while he slept. Their roles were not strictly defined, but emerged naturally from necessity and mutual respect. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Kai produced a small, carved wooden bird. He offered it to Alara. It was simple, beautifully crafted, a tiny work of art made from found wood. Alara took it, turning it over in her hands. It was the first gift she had received since her world had shattered. It was a gesture of acceptance, of shared humanity, bridging the vast cultural divide between them. Tears pricked her eyes again, but this time they were not tears of grief, but of unexpected warmth and connection. She looked at Kai, her gaze steady. "Thank you," she whispered, the first word she had spoken to him other than her name. He nodded, his eyes acknowledging her gratitude. It was a small word, but it held the weight of their shared journey, of the trust that had slowly, painstakingly, grown between them in the silence of the desert. They were two survivors, from vastly different worlds, bound together by circumstance and the quiet resilience of the human spirit. The future was still uncertain, the path ahead unknown, but she no longer faced it alone, and that made all the difference. As they continued their journey, a shift occurred in their dynamic. Alara was no longer just the vulnerable survivor being protected. She was a partner, contributing to their mutual survival with her growing knowledge and renewed strength. She learned to track alongside Kai, not with his innate skill, but with a developing eye for detail. She learned to hunt small game with snares he taught her to set. She became more attuned to the subtle language of the wilderness, recognizing warning signs, finding resources. She was transforming, shedding the passive victimhood of the massacre, hardening into something resilient and capable. Their silent communication became more nuanced, almost a language unto itself. They understood each other's intentions with a look, a gesture, a shared glance. There was a deep respect between them, a recognition of each other's strengths and a quiet acceptance of their shared vulnerability in the face of the vast, unpredictable land. They encountered challenges, difficult terrain, scarce water sources, the constant threat of predatory animals. They navigated these obstacles together, a silent, efficient team. Alara marveled at Kai's patience, his unwavering focus, his profound connection to the natural world. He seemed to draw strength from the land itself, becoming one with it. And in his presence, she felt herself becoming stronger too, learning to lean into the harshness, to find resilience within herself that she hadn't known existed. One afternoon, while they were resting near a narrow canyon, they heard sounds that brought a sudden, sharp tension to the air, the distinct, unnatural sounds of men on horseback, moving carelessly, talking loudly. Not the quiet passage of experienced travelers or native peoples, but something rougher, more intrusive. Kai's body tensed instantly. He rose, his movements swift and silent, signaling for Alara to stay hidden behind a cluster of rocks. He melted into the shadows of the canyon wall, becoming almost invisible. Alara's heart began to pound, a sickening echo of the fear that had defined her since the massacre. She couldn't see the men yet, but the sounds were getting closer. Rough voices, coarse laughter, the jingle of spurs. They sounded like the kind of men who drifted through the territory, opportunistic and dangerous. Scavengers, perhaps, drawn by tales of the massacre, or just drifters looking for trouble. She gripped a rock, ready to defend herself, though she knew it would be futile. She strained her ears, trying to understand their words, but they were still too distant. Then, she heard Kai's voice, a low, urgent sound from his hiding place. He rarely spoke aloud, and the sound startled her with its intensity. He spoke in his own language, pointing towards the top of the canyon wall, then gesturing for her to move upwards. He was telling her to climb, to get above the level of the approaching men. Her sprained ankle protested, but adrenaline surged through her veins. She understood the urgency. Staying low, they risked being trapped in the narrow canyon. Getting above might offer concealment or a better vantage point. She nodded, her eyes meeting his across the space. There was no fear in his gaze, only a quiet resolve. He would draw their attention, give her time to climb. The unspoken message was clear. Trust me, move now. She didn't hesitate. The trust they had built, thread by painstaking thread, was absolute in this moment of shared danger. She began to scramble up the rocky slope, her injured ankle aching but her muscles fueled by adrenaline. The climb was difficult, the rocks loose, the handhold scarce. She could hear the men's voices growing louder below, closer. She didn't look down, focusing solely on the climb, on finding the next grip, the next foothold. She heard Kai make a deliberate sound then, perhaps dislodging a rock or snapping a twig, a subtle distraction to draw the men's attention towards his position, away from her ascent. The sounds of the men shifted, their voices hardening, becoming alert. They had detected something. Alara reached the top of the canyon rim, breathless and trembling. She flattened herself against the ground, peering cautiously over the edge. She could see them now, a group of 5 men on horseback, rough-looking and heavily armed, moving slowly through the canyon below. They were searching, their eyes scanning the rocks. And she saw Kai, still partially concealed in the shadows, his rifle raised, watching them with lethal stillness. The tension in the air was palpable, the silence between the sounds of the men and the poised readiness of Kai screaming danger. The confrontation was imminent, and her survival, their survival, depended on their ability to act as one. The men were bounty hunters, drawn by rumors of survivors and potential valuables left behind after the massacre. Their conversation, now audible from Alara's vantage point, was coarse and greedy. They spoke of finding squaws or stragglers, hoping they might lead them to hidden caches, or simply offer a different kind of reward. The casual cruelty in their voices sent a chill down Alara's spine, a chilling reminder of the brutality she had already witnessed. Kai remained perfectly still below, a shadow amongst the rocks, his rifle trained on the approaching group. The men were spread out, moving cautiously but without the quiet skill of those who truly understood the dangers of this land. They were too loud, too obvious. Alara watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew this was the moment. The fragile peace they had found in their solitude was about to be shattered by the intrusion of human violence. She looked down at Kai, seeing his focused intensity. He was waiting for the right moment, assessing the threat. There were 5 of them, well armed. 2 against 5 seemed impossible odds, even with Kai's skill. But they had the advantage of position and surprise for now. As the men drew closer to Kai's position, their leader, a burly man with a scarred face, spotted a movement in the shadows. "Hey, who's there?" he bellowed, raising his rifle. The other men tensed, their weapons coming up. This was it. The standoff. Kai rose from his crouch, stepping partially into the open, his rifle leveled. He said something in his own language, a short, sharp utterance that held no hint of fear. The bounty hunters exchanged glances, surprised to see a lone Apache, seemingly unintimidated. "Well, looky here," the scarred man sneered. "A redskin. Think he knows something 'bout them wagons." Another man laughed. "Or maybe he's got some trinkets of his own." The tension crackled in the air. Kai stood his ground, silent, his gaze fixed on the leader. "All right, redskin, drop the rifle and come out slow," the scarred man ordered, his voice rough. Kai didn't move. The leader's face hardened. "Think you're tough? We'll see about that." He began to raise his rifle higher, aiming directly at Kai. In that instant, Alara made a choice. She was no longer the helpless victim. She had learned from Kai, learned to act, to fight for survival. She saw an opportunity. One of the horses, startled by the sudden tension, shifted nervously. Alara, remembering Kai's lesson on using the environment, grabbed a fistful of loose rocks from the canyon rim. With a fierce cry, she hurled them down into the canyon, aiming for the horses. The rocks clattered and bounced, startling the animals below. The horses shied violently, rearing and whinnying. The men shouted, struggling to control their mounts, their attention momentarily diverted. That was all the opening Kai needed. He fired. The shot echoed through the canyon. The scarred leader cried out, dropping his rifle as he clutched his shoulder. The other men reacted instantly, scattering, seeking cover. Gunfire erupted, echoing off the canyon walls. Kai moved with incredible speed, darting between rocks, his rifle spitting fire. Alara, positioned above, became a second source of chaos. She continued to rain down rocks, targeting the men or their horses, creating confusion and forcing them to expose themselves. It wasn't skilled marksmanship, but it was effective disruption. 2 more shots from Kai, precise and deadly, found their marks. 2 men crumpled from their saddles. The remaining 2, seeing their comrades fall and their horses panicking, lost their nerve. "Fall back! Fall back!" one of them yelled, turning his horse and galloping wildly out of the canyon. The other followed, abandoning their fallen companions. The sounds of gunfire subsided, leaving only the panting of the horses and the groans of the wounded. Alara stayed low, her heart still pounding, listening. Silence descended, thick and heavy. Slowly, cautiously, Alara rose. She looked down into the canyon. 3 men lay still. The other 2 were gone. And Kai stood in the open, rifle in hand, scanning the area for any remaining threat. Their shared action, her distraction from above and his precision below, had turned the tide. They had faced the threat together and emerged victorious. It was a brutal, terrifying experience, but it solidified their partnership in a way that nothing else could have. She had not just survived. She had fought, actively participated in their defense, using what she had learned from him. She was no longer defined by the massacre, but by her resilience and her ability to fight back. The silence that followed the gunfight was profound, broken only by the wind and the distant, fading hoofbeats of the retreating bounty hunters. Alara descended cautiously from her perch, her injured ankle aching but her body vibrating with adrenaline. She reached Kai's side, her gaze meeting his. There was a shared understanding in their eyes, a recognition of the danger faced and overcome together. He nodded, a brief, acknowledging gesture of approval. He didn't praise her actions, didn't need to. Her contribution, her willingness to act decisively, was its own statement. They moved among the fallen men, quickly and efficiently, retrieving weapons, ammunition, and anything useful. It was a grim task, sorting through the possessions of the dead, but necessity dictated their actions. These were resources they needed to survive. Alara did her part without flinching, her initial revulsion overridden by the pragmatism born of hardship. The bounty hunter's horses, caught and calmed by Kai with practiced ease, were a significant gain. They offered a faster, less arduous way to travel than walking. As they prepared to leave the canyon, loading the supplies onto the horses, Alara looked back at the scene of the confrontation. The violence had been swift and brutal, a necessary act of self-preservation. But unlike the senseless slaughter of the massacre, this felt different. It was a fight for their lives against those who would prey on the vulnerable. There was a grim satisfaction in having fought back, in not being simply victims. They rode out of the canyon side by side, the horses picking their way through the rough terrain. Traveling on horseback was a relief, easing the strain on Alara's ankle and allowing them to cover ground more quickly. As they rode, the silence between them was different now. It was no longer the silence of wary observation and hesitant steps towards trust, but the silence of shared experience, of a bond forged in the fire of danger. They were partners now, two individuals from disparate worlds, united by their journey and their resilience. They rode towards the setting sun, the vast landscape unfolding before them. Alara felt a sense of cautious optimism, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself since the massacre. She was still in the wilderness, still facing challenges, but she was stronger now, more capable, and she was not alone. Kai rode beside her, his presence a quiet reassurance. He was not just a protector, but a guide, a teacher, a companion. He had followed her trail not to harm her, but to help, drawn by reasons she still didn't fully understand, but no longer questioned. Their bond was unconventional, born of tragedy and necessity, a testament to the unexpected connections that can form in the harshest of circumstances. As the stars began to appear in the vast, inky sky, they made camp. They built a small fire, shared a simple meal, and sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance. Alara looked at Kai, at his face illuminated by the firelight, the same face that had once embodied her deepest fears. Now, she saw only strength, quiet wisdom, and a steadfast presence. The journey had stripped away her certainties, her prejudices, revealing the complex, often contradictory nature of the world and the people in it. She had learned that survival was not just about enduring, but about adapting, about finding strength in unexpected places, and about the profound power of human connection, even when it defied all expectations. She had started this journey trusting no one, broken and alone. Now, she trusted the silent man beside her, trusted in their shared ability to face whatever lay ahead, and, most importantly, she was beginning to trust in herself again. They traveled for many more days, the rhythm of their journey dictated by the sun, the stars, and the needs of the horses. They moved through varying landscapes, wide-open plains, rocky mesas, dry riverbeds, and canyons that echoed with the calls of unseen birds. Alara's ankle healed, leaving only a faint ache that served as a reminder of the turning point in their relationship. She became more independent, more confident in her abilities to navigate the wilderness, to find water, to track game alongside Kai. Their silent language deepened, evolving into a sophisticated form of communication based on gestures, expressions, and subtle cues. They could convey complex ideas and intentions with a glance or a movement. Alara learned more of Kai's language too, picking up words and phrases through repetition and context, slowly building a bridge between their tongues. He, in turn, seemed to understand some of her English words, or perhaps he simply understood the meaning behind her attempts to communicate. They were building something new between them, a shared world of understanding that transcended the boundaries of language and culture. Kai shared stories of his people, not through spoken words, but through gestures and by showing her places that held significance, ancient rock carvings, sacred springs, vantage points used by his ancestors. He taught her about the spirits of the land, about the interconnectedness of all living things, a worldview vastly different from her own, but one that resonated with her experiences in the wilderness. Alara, in turn, shared fragments of her own life, drawing pictures in the sand, gesturing towards the east from where she had come, conveying the loss of her family, the life she had left behind. It was a slow, tentative sharing of souls, revealing the depths of pain and resilience within each of them. The silence was no longer a barrier, but a space filled with understanding and respect. They were two wounded souls finding solace and strength in each other's company, in the quiet rhythm of their shared journey. The harsh environment that had once seemed a relentless enemy now felt different. It was still challenging, still demanded respect, but it was also the place where she had found her strength, where she had found Kai, where she had begun to heal. The massacre was a scar she would always carry, a wound that would never fully close, but it no longer defined her entirely. She was not just the sole survivor. She was Alara, a woman who had faced the depths of despair and emerged, tempered by fire, strong and capable. Their destination was unspoken, perhaps unknown even to Kai. They simply moved, following the needs of survival, guided by Kai's deep knowledge of the land. They avoided settlements, aware of the dangers that white communities held for Kai, and the potential for painful reminders that settlements held for Alara. Their world was the wilderness, their community just the two of them. It was a lonely existence by conventional standards, but it was also a life of profound connection and self-reliance. Alara felt a sense of freedom she had never known before, a shedding of societal expectations and constraints. She was learning to trust her instincts, to rely on her own strength, and to appreciate the quiet power of the natural world. The journey was not just a physical movement across the land, but an internal one, a shedding of old fears and prejudices, a growth into a new version of herself. She had come into this wilderness broken and terrified, trusting no one, least of all the man who now rode beside her, a silent, steadfast presence against the vast horizon. The land began to change, the arid desert giving way to rolling hills and sparse woodlands. They were moving towards higher ground, a different part of the territory. The air grew cooler, the vegetation more varied. This was a place less overtly hostile than the sun-scorched plains, but it held its own challenges and its own subtle beauty. Alara's competence continued to grow. She could set a fire in damp conditions, identify and prepare a wider range of edible plants, track with a proficiency that surprised her. She learned to handle a rifle, practicing with quiet determination under Kai's patient, silent guidance. He showed her how to load, aim, and fire, his movements precise and economical. She wasn't a natural marksman, but she became capable, able to defend herself and contribute to their hunting efforts. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and strong. Her body, once weakened by fear and privation, was lean and resilient. She carried herself differently, with a quiet confidence that had replaced the slumped posture of despair. The transformation was physical, but it was also deeply internal. She had faced her worst fears, survived unimaginable trauma, and emerged with a strength she had never known she possessed. Her trust in Kai was complete now, a quiet certainty born of shared trials and his unwavering presence. She had seen his courage, his integrity, his deep humanity. He was not a symbol of a feared people, but simply Kai, her companion, her protector, her friend. And he, in turn, seemed to see her not as a fragile white woman needing rescue, but as Alara, a resilient spirit capable of adapting and fighting. There was a mutual respect that ran deeper than words. One evening, they came across a small, secluded valley with a clear stream running through it. It was a place of quiet beauty, sheltered and peaceful. They made camp near the stream, the sound of running water a soothing melody after weeks of silence or the dry rustle of the plains. As they sat by the fire, A comfortable silence settled between them. Alara looked at Kai, feeling a sense of profound connection to this man who had entered her life out of tragedy and changed its course. She had come so far from the broken, terrified woman who had crawled out of the wreckage. She had learned to live again, to find moments of peace and even beauty in a world that had seemed devoid of hope. She had learned that resilience was not about being unafraid, but about facing fear and moving forward anyway. She had learned that trust, though fragile and hard-earned, was essential, and that it could be found in the most unexpected places, in the most unexpected people. Kai had been a silent figure following her trail, an embodiment of her fears. He had become the steady hand that guided her, the quiet strength that supported her, the unexpected light in her darkest hour. Their journey together was not over, the future uncertain. But they faced it together, two souls walking a path carved out of wilderness and shared resilience. The memories of the massacre would always be a part of her, a somber thread woven into the fabric of her life. But it was no longer the entire tapestry. It was a chapter, a brutal beginning to a new story, a story of survival, transformation, and the quiet, powerful bond between two unlikely companions, bound by the vast, silent land and the shared knowledge that even in the face of utter devastation, hope and connection could still find a way to bloom. She had lost everything, but she had found something too: her own strength, her resilience, and a trust deeper than any she had known before, forged in the crucible of the wilderness with the silent man who had followed her trail.